Welcome, everybody, to this wonderful building, wonderful room, wonderful set of rooms, which has been incredibly generously lent tonight by Matt. We greatly appreciate how generous they are. Tonight we have a fantastic history experience about to take place. This is the Exceptional Contribution to Biography Award, which this year is going to A.N.Wilson. I should say that Andrew has, this is an award which has a great and important history. Almost every leading biographer has been given this award.
Many of them are sitting here and they haven't been given this. They won't be very pleased to hear
that. Andrew has a huge claim to be an exceptional contributor to biography, having written over 40 books, or published over 50 books, sorry. And of those, I'm not sure how many, but a good...
Some, but yeah.
Yes. And the sum is also, the range of these books is gobsmacking. It really is extraordinary. So that Andrew has written biographies, this is only an edited list, of Walter Scott, John Milton, Hilaire Belloc, C.S. Lewis, the Queen, Charles Darwin, Jesus, Iris Murdoch.
Steady on. Some of those aren't really biographies, but anyway, carry on.
Betjeman, Tolstoy.
The two most remarkable people you've named, I won't say their names because it's blasphemous. They're not really biographies, the Queen and the other one. But
the Queen was rather good.
Oh, well, thank you. But carry on.
Two more, Victoria and Albert.
Yes, well, they were, and that's where you and I link up.
Yes.
Because you are the great one.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
I follow it.
My output is sort of,
But we sometimes, don't want to sound too chummy, but we sometimes coincide in the round tower in rather than the bloody tower. It used to be the bloody tower when we began there. When Jane and I began our royal biography career, the archivist in the round tower,
which will remain nameless,
who is nameless, made it absolutely bloody, but now it's lovely.
Anyway, what I think we're going to do, the order is I'm going to start talking about Andrew's most recent book, which is called Confessions, and it is actually it's an autobiography, a life of failed promises.
Yes.
And I just wonder, Andrew, why it was that you decided to write an autobiography?
Well, I mean, the main reason was that there was COVID-19 and we were locked up, so I couldn't go to a library or anything like that. And so the only possible thing I could do was to follow Sir Philip Sidney's advice: look in your heart and write. So I wrote about myself, but it wasn't an entirely successful operation in my opinion, but anyway. So I mustn't put you off guard.
I mean, what were the difficulties of writing autobiography apart from lockdown?
Feeling that one would upset somebody or another.
Living people.
Yes.
Yeah.
All the dead, but mainly the living.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you realise either you stop writing this ridiculous book or you forget about the people who might be upset.
Yes, you've got to look at that later.
Yes.
I mean, just write it.
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder, you've written millions of words, you say, in newspaper articles,
Yes.
which you say is a highly addictive occupation.
Highly.
And you describe vividly the adrenaline rush that you first experienced as a schoolboy when something that you wrote was published in the Daily Express, and which continues to this day.
Yes.
So, I mean...
that was in a way if there's a devil, that was when the devil entered my life. The Queen was coming to visit my boarding school, and I was the editor of the school magazine, and I wrote this article, which I still would agree with, saying public schools were absolutely dreadful institutions, and private education was a dodgy moral question. And the only way round it was to offer free places to everybody at schools such as the one I attended. And the Queen, who was opening these rather ugly modern gates, which had just been put up for 400 years at the school I attended, should throw open the gates of all these private institutions to anybody who was clever enough to attend them. Anyway, for some reason or another, the stringer at the local paper, the Rugby Evening Advertiser, alerted the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, and it was the Daily Express who put it on the front page. Sir John Junior, bless his heart. But it was terribly exciting, and I've never actually known that kind of excitement from a writing life point of view. I mean, no personal excitement, but that's nothing to do with anybody in this room. But that was the moment I realised how exciting it could be to write something, and it appears the next day in the Daily Express. In those days, the Daily Express wasn't a tabloid; it was a broadsheet, and it was owned by Lord Beaverbrook. And the whole all round the house where I was, the boarding house at my school, there were these snappers and photographers waiting for me to come out. And I was immediately kidnapped by the housemaster and put in the Sand, which was our local hospital, where I was kept until the Queen's visit was well over. It was marvellous. It was fantastic. And I've never really got over that, you're quite right. So although I might be being honoured tonight, thank you very, very much, and I don't deserve it, not at all, for writing books. The excitement of writing journalism, which appears the same day sometimes, or certainly the next day.
Do you think it's the same with online journalism?
No, funnily enough, but that's because I'm old. I'm sure it is if you are young.
Yeah.
But I think just seeing something on a paper, sitting opposite somebody on the train who's reading your rubbish, it's just wonderful.
You write a lot in the book about your childhood,
Yes.
but it's not
it's mainly
always...
about the childhood.
Yes.
Really. And it's mainly about my mother and father, which
Yes.
is why I hesitated to write it.
Because they're both well dead.
They're dead, but you never quite believe your parents are dead. They're always gazing at you.
Did you find it difficult?
I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I was taught for 1.5 glorious terms by Lord David Cecil, who'd come out of retirement and said he wanted to find some undergraduates to teach because he was so bored. And the only time he criticised something I'd written, he said, "I don't think you should write that. I don't think that George Eliot would be in the least pleased if she were to hear you say that." And I said, "Why does it matter? She's dead." And he said, "That doesn't matter at all. You should never write anything about somebody which you wouldn't be prepared to read aloud to them when they were alive." I don't agree with that at all. How could I survive as a gutter journalist if I did? But anyway, I certainly feel it about my mother and father. And my mother would not be pleased by what I've written about her in this book, but that's because it's true.
But I think she comes out rather well.
So do I. But she still would be displeased.
I mean, you say somewhere in the book that you hated being a child.
I loathed it. Philip Larkin once said to me, sorry to name drop, I used to think that I hated everyone when I was a kid. And when I grew up, I realised it was just kids I hated. That wasn't my experience, but my experience was that it was awful being a child, particularly being a middle-class child in 1950s, 1960s England, where it was assumed you were going to be taken away from all the people you liked, and you were going to be shoved into a boarding school. Nobody cared tuppence about what happened to you. And they were, of course, all university ghastly places.
Well, your boarding school seems to have been the prep school from hell.
I think it was. We've just been talking about it earlier. I've had connections with it. Certainly, yeah.
People who don't, perhaps we could just illuminate.
Well, like all these places, the parents, particularly parents like mine, who were middle class but fairly uncertain about class. Class dominated everything in England in the 40s, 50s and 60s. And so to send your child to one of these schools was to guarantee that he would then go on to boarding school for older children, and it would guarantee that you spoke in the stupid way I speak, and that you would belong to a class above. My father was, among other things, he was an industrialist, and he was the managing director of the factory, Wedgwood factory.
He was hugely talented.
And he was hugely talented. But there was a sense that the workers, the people who worked in these places, were your inferiors. And you were guaranteed a place which was higher than them. And the way you were guaranteed was by learning how to parse Latin verse, which was one of the things you had to do in order to pass the exam to get into these boarding schools. And very silly it all was in many ways. But that was what got you into these places. But in order to get into a public school, you had to go to these prep schools, or private schools as they used to be called. And they were almost universally run by damaged people of one kind or another. I mean, they were men who'd come out of wars. And my one was run by a pair for whom, it may surprise you, Jane, to know, I feel a sort of affection, funnily enough. But
Barbara, you do?
Barbara, I do. But Barbara was the wife. She was the daughter of the headmaster of Harrow. She was very beautiful. She was a sadist in the strictest sense of the word. I mean, Proust would have adored her. Because she has all the kind of instincts of Madame de Vinteuil, if you know that novel. She loved causing pain and watching the effect the pain had on people. Whether it was physical pain, there's a chapter in the book where my poor parents talked about how slow I am learning how to swim, and they didn't notice her eyes light up at the prospect that I was frightened of water. And so the minute my parents had disappeared, I was being pushed off the high diving board with an umbrella and all the rest of it. If she discovered that she didn't like a particular food, you had to eat and eat and eat until you were sick. Children she didn't like, she locked up in a cage. And then just at the moment when sort of 3 or 4 hours had passed, so it was obvious they were going to wet themselves, she would get all the other little boys to come and watch. So there was something ingenious about the levels of her stupidity. But it would have been hell to be her, because, and goodness knows what her own childhood was like, because she was married to this person who was compulsively paedophile and sadistic. I won't go into it, it was a very mixed company, and we're meant to be having a semi-happy time. But it was awful, and without wanting to sort of to go on about it, it is extraordinary to think that so many people of my class, generation, etc., went through versions of this.
I think it's also extraordinary the way that you were able to stop it, or at least help to stop it.
My mother stopped it,
yeah.
in a sense. One of my colleagues, one of my little boyfriends, not boyfriends, but friends who was a boy, ran home to his mother to say that the headmaster made an improper advance. And that was the moment when 2 of the other masters at the school said, we've been waiting for this. And she rang up my mother, and my mother and the other woman came down to the school. And the other masters, whom we thought very peculiar, I mean, one was very advanced alcoholic, and the other was quite a strange man. No interest in us, very great interest in all the matrons and wives of the other stuff. Anyway, they confronted this headmaster who was in Great Malton, Worcestershire, where this school was. These people were the sort of aristocracy of Malton. He was the Justice of the Peace. He was regarded as an impeccable and wonderful person. And they said, you must resign at once, or we're calling the police. And he did. So it was rather brilliant. Though I said how brilliant it was to a friend of mine who went to a girls' school in the town called Lawnside, which we all call Lawnseed for some fairly obvious reasons. She said, thanks very much, because he then came on to us. And his productions of plays were something to behold. And somebody who was quite a famous publisher was one of the girls at Lawnside when he was the so-called English master there, putting on a production of Jane Austen, because he didn't limit his interests to little boys, and they had quite a time of it. It was a Jane Austen as few had ever understood the word.
So once you've got rid of him, really the next, there's not much in the book about your public school days.
No, there isn't really.
Which featured much less than Oxford. Oxford was a huge escape.
Well, yes, it was, and I mean, I spent 15 years of my life in Oxford, one way or another. Mark Lepidord is here. He's one of my best friends at New College. And that was wonderful. And we all felt a sense of liberation from our childhoods, I think, when that happened. And it was the very end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. 69, 70 was when we began to be undergraduates for 3 years. And it was glorious, absolutely wonderful.
The undergraduate bit?
Yes.
But then you stayed on. And taught the most
it was entirely, when I think of people spending 9, 10 more thousand pounds to have a year at a university and then another 10,000, I think it's awful. Nobody checks whether anyone knows anything of these universities teaching. And I hardly knew anything about medieval literature, but I was taken on to teach because we were taught by a man called Christopher Tolkien, who became a good friend of mine, whose father wrote Lord of the Rings. And when the professor died, Christopher went to live in the south of France, and he knew I was working as a schoolmaster at that stage and said, would I like to come and take over from him and teach, which I did for 7 years. I mean, I had a basic knowledge of Old English and Middle English and so on, but I was in no sense a scholar. It was disgraceful, really, trying to teach this.
You weren't allowed the nice bits in each, were you? I mean, it was just...
Oh, well, there was, in a way, my hero, he doesn't come into the book, at Oxford, was a professor called Professor Campbell, who wrote one book called The Old English Grammar. And he used to say, I have 3 ambitions. One was to write a book, I wrote The Old English Grammar. The other was to have a child, I got a son. And the third was to drive a racing car at Brands Hatch, which he did. And anyway, I don't remember why I said that. The point is, I knew nothing basically about these subjects. Oh, I know why I said it. It's because you said I got the bad bit. He used to say, literature stopped in 1100.
Oh, right.
After that, there's only books. And I sort of agree with that. That's not really.
But one thing that is going on at this time is that you're thinking a lot about religion, flirting with getting ordained, sometimes thinking of becoming a Roman Catholic.
Sort of, yes. One of the reviewers, they were all very kind, the reviewers, funnily enough, on this book, said, let's think that's the end of that subject in his life. So let's say that for this evening, because they're all bored stiff by religion.
Oh, right.
Let's pass that. It's true, there is quite a lot of it in the book. One of my friends wrote saying, I can't imagine why you thought there was so much religion going on in Oxford. There was none, as far as I was concerned. You seem to have lived in, never mind the 19th century, you seem to have lived in 1528. It's perfectly true. I still do, but I don't want to talk about it.
There are some rather good lines, such
Oh,
as, I still read the New Testament in Greek each year. I thought that was rather impressive.
Well, it's quite easy, though.
Oh.
It's not like reading Sappho or something. It is easy.
Right. Take your word for it. And so, by the time that the book ends,
Yeah.
you are quite keen to escape from Oxford.
Very.
You have made up your mind very clearly that you're not going to be an academic.
Well, I was a fake academic, you see.
But I mean, you didn't want an academic career in any case, so there was...
No, I mean, it would have destroyed me if I'd been given one, certainly. I was off, in the course of this book, I was offered an actually proper academic job at St Andrews University.
That would have destroyed you.
It would have certainly destroyed me, because although what saved me from all this was what we called Fleet Street in those days. It might sound rather paradoxical to say that had I gone to St Andrews, I know I'd have died of drink, because the extraordinary thing is that one didn't die of drink working in Fleet Street in the 80s.
Oh, but nearly you did.
Well, I didn't, but it's just people drank a lot of it.
Yeah, yeah. So, in fact, by what, your mid-30s, you were quite keen to escape from Oxford and to
I was really.
and to London, and the Spectator played an absolutely crucial part in all of this.
I was.
By the way, just what to ask, can you hear at the back?
Oh, yes.
I was dithering about whether or not to try and perfect the fake that I was an academic person and write a PhD or something like that. And I was given this subject by one of the medieval professors, which was to write about Lydgate's Fall of Troy. It's a poem of 70,000 lines, and it is incredibly boring. And just as I was dithering about that, the editor of The Spectator rang up and said, would you like to become a literary editor? So I said, yes, absolutely, immediately. And
That was amazing.
I never looked back.
And you've written for them a bit, didn't you?
I'd written for them, yes.
Yeah. I think the
It was Peter Ackroyd, who was a friend of mine, who had been a literary editor, who recommended me. It wasn't really Alexander Chancellor. Peter got his job as a literary editor when he was 23. He just came back from America, and he went to see George Gale, who was then the editor. And he said, would it be possible to write the occasional article? And George Gale said, no, I don't think there's any chance of you ever writing occasional articles this way. We do all the occasional articles. I said, we do them all ourselves. No chance at all. And so Peter went down the long stone stairs, which were in those days in Gower Street, and very disappointed. And then George yelled over the balcony, well, you're to become a literary editor if you like. So he became a literary editor at the age of 23. And he did it brilliantly. And then he wrote film reviews. And he always wrote every week in The Spectator when I was there.
And how old were you when you became literary editor?
30, I think.
It's very young.
28.
It's an important position. I mean, you have a lot of influence.
Well,
you can destroy people.
Oh, I don't think importance comes into it. Self-importance, maybe. Do you think you can destroy? You know, whoever it was said, poor Keats is dying of a review in the Quarterly. Don't mean Jonathan Keats.
Not yet.
But do you think people are destroyed by reviews? I don't think they are.
Well, they feel quite sad about it.
They do, and tell me about it. But, no, I mean, it's true that literary journalism used to be a kind of semi-art form in the 30s and 40s and 50s, but I don't think it is anymore. And anyway, nowadays you can just say, anybody can say what they like about a book online, so it's a bit different. Whereas in the past, you waited to see what will Cyril Connolly say on Sunday morning about a particular book, or what would Raymond Mortimer say, or these sort of grandees.
So, in what we're talking about, 70s,
yes.
80s?
50s, 60s, and then I think it was dying out by the time I arrived. But certainly some of these old, distinguished old people did write for us at The Spectator. It was perfectly true. And it was wonderful meeting them and hearing all their stories and memories of the good old days, or the bad old days.
Yeah. So how long were you at The Spectator?
2 and a bit years.
And that had a sort of...
Well, I was an idiot. I quite rightly got the sack, but we didn't go into that.
but then, yes.
I mean, otherwise I'd have stayed and stayed and stayed.
That wouldn't have been bad.
No, I'd have loved it.
Yeah.
And they're all very nice people.
And then Algie Clough, I thought helped.
Well, Algie Clough remains a great hero and protector of mine, and I mean
he's the owner.
He owned The Spectator. He was an army officer. He then he's like an old Victorian buccaneer, really, because he invested very boldly in drilling for oil all over the place, and he found little bits of oil here, there, and everywhere. And on the strength of this, he bought the Spectator and protected us all. It would have gone down the drain had it not been for another person who's present here tonight, James Knox, who went round getting advertising. Because, I mean, people here now think the Spectator is just an institution like the Church of England or the trade unions that has always been there. But it would have unquestionably folded had it not been for James Knox and Algy Clough. Algy losing the money week by week, which, people like the editor of the Spectator and his gang were drinking every single week. It was astonishing, the meal bills and the drink bills which were sent to Algy Clough, which he dutifully paid. But when I got the sack, he went on paying my salary until I finished this book about Tolstoy, which is closer to the subject that we were meant to be talking about. Yeah. I mean, it was a wonderful act of generosity.
Yeah.
Never to be forgotten.
No, I think, yeah. Well, I must say I do think it's thoroughly enjoyable, your book, and
Thank you,
definitely
Jane.
to be bought and read by everybody in this room. Andrew, I wondered, just picking up where you left off, tell us, I mean, this decision to write about Tolstoy,
Yes.
what informed it?
Well, when I was a boy at the second boarding school, rugby school, a man called, well, it doesn't matter what he was called, he was called Samson, but it doesn't really matter. He was a professor at Bristol, came and told us about Tolstoy. And I'd read Anna Karenina, and funnily enough, my sister had given me War and Peace for Christmas, but I hadn't got round to reading it yet. What I didn't know was Tolstoy's row with the Russian government, which went on for 35 years, and why, when he died, the church forbade him a funeral. But this enormous crowd, one of the biggest demos that has ever occurred in Europe, followed the coffin, all singing Eternal Memory, the great Russian hymn, because he had described what life was like for the poor in Russia, what life was like for people who weren't orthodox in either the small or the big O sense of the word. He'd stuck up for the oddballs, the outcasts of society, and seen what was essentially violent about government itself. And I was tremendously excited by that, and I've constantly put it at the side of my mind, that side of Tolstoy, i.e. the great majority of his works and things he's written. But as I grew older, I realized he was right mainly about things. He wasn't right about Shakespeare. He was really absolutely nonsense about Shakespeare. But he was right in his criticisms of society. And he was a giant. And he was the first person, I think, in history who, Nelson Mandela was one, Gandhi was another. It is possible for an individual, particularly a writer, to stand up against a system and win. He won, really. He didn't win against the Russian Empire, but he was behind Gandhi, and he was responsible for the destruction of the British Empire. So that, for my mind, is hooray. I know it's not entirely hooray for everybody in this room, but it was hooray. Because, I mean, he inspired Gandhi. When Gandhi was a lawyer in South Africa, he was steeped in Tolstoy. And it was entirely based on Tolstoy, the idea that you could resist passively. You didn't have to fight a war. And it also inspired Mandela later in South African history. So those sort of things gripped me, and I wanted to come to grips with the Russian language, which I'd fallen in love with. And I loved going to Russia in those days. Soviet Russia was awful, of course it was, but it wasn't as awful as post-Soviet Russia.
So I mean, you researched in Russia?
There was a marvellous place which was much more welcoming than the round tower at Windsor Castle when you and I first met, called the Tolstoy Institute in Moscow. And you derived from everything you needed that would be set out in front of you, and some kind person would come and say, have you ever read this, or would you like to see these letters, whatever it might be.
And this was in the Soviet years before?
That was in the Soviet years, yes.
Yeah.
became the Gorbachev years, and so people would come up to you and say, he's going to change everything, and you would just think, oh yeah, of course, we've had that before. But he did, of course.
So
that was all because of Algae. I wouldn't have been able to do it without Algae Club, because I didn't have any money. You paid for it.
Yeah. And this was your first big, well, no, there was a biography of Scott,
book,
wasn't
really.
there?
Well, Sir Walter Scott book
Yeah.
is just a bit of literary appreciation, really, of the Scott novels. It's not a biography, really.
So, which is the book you enjoyed writing most,
Oh, golly.
or liked best of all of your biographies?
Oh, heavens above. I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, when John Betjeman's daughter asked me to write a shorter book than dear old Bevis Hillier's Doorstoppers to commemorate her father being aged 100, that was pure bliss. And so I think I'd say it was the Betjeman book. But that was pleasure rather than thinking he was a greater person than Tolstoy or some of the other people you named.
Mm-hmm.
But it was utter bliss writing about Betjeman.
What, could you write such nice letters?
Well, he was a very funny letter writer. His life was admirable in my view. And he was such a delightful person.
Mm. But what about royal biography?
Oh, well, I'd forgotten about that until you mentioned that. So, in fact, can I scrub the last answer? Because actually the book I think is, in a way, my best biography is The Life of Prince Albert. And I loved writing that book. And I totally forgot about it. Sorry about that. But no, that is because that's crammed with really new stuff, which nobody else had ever put in a book about Prince Albert. And also, he's such an interesting person, Prince Albert, for reasons which probably nobody in this room wants to hear. But he was quite boring, but I'm boring in a way. I mean, he loved everything. He loved science. He loved technology. He loved industry. He saw the way society was changing inevitably.
Do you think he's somebody who appeals more to men than women? I remember getting terribly annoyed by Albert because I felt that he gave Queen Victoria rather a rough time. I know she was intolerable. But
when I wrote my Victoria book, I rather hated Prince Albert because he was a horrible husband.
It could be agreed.
An absolutely horrible husband. He was cold. He didn't understand women. He didn't like women. And he thought that he should discipline her when she was, quite understandably, throwing wobblies and screaming and being very, very unhappy.
Having postnatal depression.
Having postnatal, prenatal, and during pregnancy depressions of all kinds. And she was a character from an opera, and he was a character in prose. And it was a disaster marriage, actually. I mean, the reason some people never get over a marriage and go on grieving in black for the rest of their lives is not because, well, going back to David Cecil, who made that rather priggish remark about you shouldn't read something about George Eliot, when his wife died, I said, I'm so sorry, it must be awful. And he said, it's not awful because we never had a moment of unhappiness. There's nothing to look back on with any regret. And he was by then very old. Whereas Queen Victoria had much to look back on with great regret, and Albert had a disastrous, dysfunctional family background. His father was an extraordinary, womanizing, syphilitic bully, physical bully. His mother, one doesn't want to be scandalous, but the parallels are extraordinary. She even died in Paris. Was a teenage bride to this terrible bully, and had a terrible time. And the marriage ended when Prince Albert was a tiny child. He had hardly any memories of his mother. And so he wasn't, and he was brought up entirely by men. He hardly even had a nanny. So yes, you're quite right to say that if you're a woman, it's very hard to like Prince Albert. But he was, nonetheless, a person of near genius, I would say, an utterly fascinating person.
Yeah, and he was so able. I mean, putting a great exhibition together when you were sort of 30,
I know.
this massive project, and he really did do it, didn't just sit there.
He really did do it. They also all put the difference between the Great Exhibition of 1851 and the Dome. They all put their own money into it. I mean, Sir Henry Cole, Prince Albert and so on, they actually put their money into it. If it failed, it would have been their money down the drain. Nobody would be the worse off, etc. And Holland is expanding upon. But I mean, even to this hour, if you go to the office, which is tucked in the middle of Imperial College, of the 1851 Commission, you'll see graduates queuing out to get money from the 1851 Commission. All the money they made from that exhibition paid for the Royal College of Music, the Royal College of Needlework, the Royal Albert Hall, etc., 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 and the Natural History Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's just extraordinary.
Albertopolis.
The Albertopolis, and it jolly well is the Albertopolis, and we in this country owe so much to that man. The greatest import from Germany this country's ever had, and also who grounded us. Don't want some sort of political propaganda, but he was European and reminded us that we were a European country. And anyway,
Yeah.
don't get me started.
It
It wasn't. I don't think we'd have particularly thought he was charming or anything like that. He was just incredibly impressive.
Yes. Yeah. But he's had a bad press, actually,
Yes.
except with you. I think you're quite right.
Very few jokes, I'm afraid.
But what do you think of the future? You know, we've got what the future of role biography in relation to, e.g., Prince Harry.
Well, it's an absurd thing.
But I mean, is he putting everything out there? I mean,
You would know, but as well as I would. I mean, nobody knows how much of this book is fiction, and it's pathetic. But it's a brilliant piece of ghostwriting, by the way.
yes.
It is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And he starts. I mean, the ghost, Prince Harry. It's a fascinating. I think it's a bit like reading a book by Nabokov because, for a start, it's unreliable narrator. And you get to the end and realise none of it can actually be true. But also, it's so weird because the narrator is cleverer than the subject who appears to be talking about it. So he keeps saying, I never read Shakespeare, and then there's some rather brilliant comparison between somebody who's, when he compares himself with Hamlet at one point, and that says that's why he doesn't like Hamlet, and won't go to Hamlet with his father, but he then shows that he's actually appreciated what Hamlet is about, and the obsession with his mother. And
Gosh, you've read it.
oh yes.
Actually, one of the things about you, you're a great reader.
Well, I mean, I think everyone in this room, we're surrounded by books. I don't think it's that unusual. It's true. I do like reading books, but in this particular case, I have read it, yes. And I very much respect and admire the ghostwriters,
Yes.
team of ghostwriters, who've made it seem as though it's a proper story, really, which of course it isn't. It's just this silly chump who in the old days would have remained in the British Army, but now you have to be clever to stay in the British Army. And if you're thick, you got chucked out of the army, and that's the beginning and end of the story, really, but you didn't realise how much it's I don't think you'll have any effect on royal life or something like that, do you?
I don't know. I mean, I really don't know, because there's nothing coming from the other side.
No, there's nothing.
Yeah. But people sometimes are quite sort of, pessimistic about the future of biography as a form. What do you feel? And equally about the novel. But
it's interesting you should say that, because one of the things which is the basis of a great many biographies, not all, but a great many of the biographies that we've all enjoyed in this room, are letters. And now people don't write letters anymore. You somehow sending an email is not quite the same.
so they're ephemeral, aren't they? I mean, they're not going to. I mean, are they going to?
And they're ephemeral.
Yeah.
So there won't be an archive, royal or otherwise, Well, actually, with the present king, we know there are going to be huge amounts of letters, the spidery letters. But he'll probably be the last person in history of whom the old-fashioned biography of the kind that so many of us in this room, dear colleagues, who slaved through archives and enjoyed it so much. And there's nothing more enjoyable, of course.
No.
I mean, you're thinking of Queen Victoria. Prince Albert's letters were boring, but to be rung up by somebody when one was writing about Queen Victoria and said, do you realise we've got a whole cache of letters from Queen Victoria? And bowl over to, in this case, Shoolbreed, where Sir Hubert Parry lived, home of the Punsonbys, and to find sort of 200 or 300 letters by Queen Victoria.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It was wonderful. And of course, only about 10 of them are legible, but that doesn't happen.
But we don't think that meant she drank too much at night.
Oh no, just when you'd see her letters when she was 22, she the real killers are the letters she wrote in what she regarded as German, which are a funny kind of patois that she wrote.
And German you can do too?
I can do German, but I can't do her German exactly. But when she forgot a word, it just went straight into English.
Yeah.
And she very often didn't do the German word order properly. But as you know, my mother could write the old script and read it, but I can't really. I mean, it takes me an hour to read a letter in the old German script. But her version of the old German script is even more like this than her English writing. So it is very peculiar. But
yes.
I mean, the lady who was married to her brother-in-law, Ernst,
Yes.
the Duchess of Saxe-Coburg, she got a letter from Queen Victoria every single week. And that's the most extraordinary kind of news bulletin from England, which is sitting there in Coburg. Thank God there was a maniac in the 1930s or 40s who typed it all out so you can read it.
Oh, so have you read this?
Yes.
Gosh, I don't, yeah.
She doesn't tell you much about scandal, but it is a wonderful commentary on the... They should be published, really, as they stand. They're not as interesting as the one she wrote to Vicky in Berlin, but they are rather good. And there are also lots of stuff which would interest some people in this room, I know, but didn't really interest me, about, for instance, all the hunt and all the deer stalking and things in Scotland she was obsessed by. Particularly after Prince Albert died.
Yes, she ran it, didn't she?
She ran it. She was very, very keen on running. And also she wanted, unlike Prince Albert, of course, and the German way, I know we have German friends here tonight, but the German way of hunting shocked people in the 19th century because it was so cruel. And particularly Lord Aberdeen, when he lent his otter hounds to Prince Albert. I think it was you who pointed this out to me, Jane, but the others might not know.
Yeah.
Lord Aberdeen was horrified that Prince Albert's way of hunting an otter was to get the hounds and hoik an otter out of the river and just put it in a courtyard and watch the dogs eat it.
That wasn't me.
Well, somebody did tell me that in Scotland.
Yeah.
And Queen Victoria did go back to British ways of hunting, but she ran the hunt, you're perfectly right.
You never can get enough of Queen Victoria, can one?
No.
I think
And
we
everything about her is a surprise.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, she's a great person to write about. I think we should see if we have any questions. Johnny.
I was going to ask you a question which actually you have more or less answered about the whole relationship between autobiography and biography on the one hand and truth on the other. Should we expect, when we go to books like these, should we expect truth, or are we instead, should we go to them as a form of fiction?
Well, of course we should expect truth on one level, because that's, if you give up the idea of truth, even in the branch of art or fantasy that I've confessed I enjoy dabbling in, journalism, you have to have the notion that what you say is true rather than false. I think outright lying would be intolerable. But on the other hand, it would be a brave person who thought there was only one truth, particularly in the case of biography, where obviously you're, well, we just demonstrated, Jane and I, for example, was Prince Albert a good husband, a bad husband, was he a nice man, was he that's a matter of opinion, isn't it? And so I think it's very, very difficult. And Goethe's name for his autobiography, Dichtung und Wahrheit, is the reason he called it that was that there are some things which are, I mean, Dichtung doesn't just mean poetry for him, it means the whole imaginative life, and the whole take on life which writers have set side by side with what actually happened, the Wahrheit, the truth. And you'll never get that balance completely right, but in the great writers you do get something approximating to it.
Do we have another question?
How do you know when to stop researching?
No.
And when do you know you've got enough to write?
How do you know when you stop is, I'm afraid, because I'm a hack writer rather than somebody who has a private income who writes for pleasure. I stopped writing when the deadline approaches. And it was into the publishing. It's as simple as that.
Mark.
Andrew, to my surprise, I have to say that you did yourself down when you told us that you were not a scholar and not an academic. You and I remember perfectly well our first term at Oxford,
yes,
when most of us were struggling into Tennyson and Browning, and you, deny it if you dare, you were reading Comte Patmore and George Meredith.
Well, I wouldn't deny it. It's perfectly true.
But so, I have a serious question also while I'm going. You have an enormous felicity with writing. I'm just saying, you can write like Shakespeare, they say, just wrote it all off without stopping.
Well, Shakespeare was said by Ben Jonson never to blot a line,
Yeah.
but there the resemblance ends. I'm not living in a fantasy world.
I'm not here solely to praise you, but was.
Sorry to hear it.
In the piece of autobiography that you gave us recently, there are moments when I thought you'd written some of this a long time ago, and I wondered whether you actually have scraps of writing of your own which you put into books later on.
That's an interesting archival question, and actually not true. But it's possible that some of these events or memories, if they are accurate memories, going back to what Jonathan Keats has asked, I tell myself so often that it was as if I'd written it. That is possible. But I mean, Mark, the questioner, and I were at New College together 3 happy years, and so, I mean, he knows me too well in a way.
They were golden years.
They were.
My God, they were. Yes.
One of the things that impressed me about him when he first gave me tea was that he opened the teapot, and then rather than putting in the tea with a spoon, he just stooped into the tea caddy with his fingers and tossed it in. I just thought that was so sort of 18th century and ironic, and I don't know why. Probably still does it.
Andrew, who of all the people you haven't written about would you like to write about?
Oh, well, apart from yourself, of course. Oh, goodness. I honestly, I'm so old now that I don't feel it quite... At the moment I'm trying to write about Goethe, whom I've mentioned already. And I think if I ever get to the top of that mountain or the bottom of that valley, that will have been enough probably. Because it's so all-encompassing and so strange. But funnily enough, I am going to go back to Prince Albert, for reasons too boring to explain now, but I am. And I would like to go back to Tolstoy. And if I was a free man and didn't have to pay the bills and all that kind of stuff, I would like to write about Simone Weil, who's my all-time heroine. But I doubt whether anybody would want to read what I had to say about it.
I would. Please do. Please, two sentences.
Can you explain why?
Well, I just think, in the time I knew Mark Lord first, we were taught by a man called John Bailey, and his wife was called Iris Murdoch, who was very, very famous at the time. And we were in awe of her, but also she was jolly nice to us all. And she gave me a paperback of Simone Weil when I was an undergraduate, and I was completely knocked for six by it. And I still think it's, in a way, one of the most remarkable things I've ever read. And, not one of the most, I think it is, she is the most remarkable person of the 20th century, I think.
Yeah.
I think she's just, I think she saw into the life of what had happened to make all the horror, not just the obvious horror of the wars, which she wrote about so brilliantly in her essay on the Iliad, but also how something that my father in this book is brought up in, industrialization, reified, as she called it, people. I mean, it made people into things. That so many people were working. I'd never drive a car, which had been put together by Simone Weil, but she worked for 2 heroic years in a Renault car factory. I should have been warned every vehicle that came out of that factory. But she experienced at first hand what it was like to be on the production line. And you still read these horror stories now of, for example, in Amazon packing factories, where people have to work harder than it's possible to work. And you lose any sense of your inner life. And she holds on to the idea that our inner life is central to the way that we live. And it's what all the great poets have written about, it's what all the philosophers have tried to define. And the system, in this case the capitalist system, in the old days the system of slavery and tyranny, destroys that in the lives of the majority of human beings. The majority, that's what is so, sitting in this beautiful room with all, all of us, with our clever minds and our leisure, we forget all the time. She never forgot it for a single second. And she died at, 35 or something? In Ashford.
Yeah, short life.
Yeah. A short book for a short life.
Andrew, how do you feel? How will you feel when someone asks to write your biography?
I think they should deserve psychological advice. I think they would be crazy. It's a simple answer.
Well, I suppose one question might be, if there's a diary.
No, I mean, I'm not going to go into this. It's an absurd question. Nobody would want to read it. I haven't done, as it's already been established, I've had to write 150 books to pay the rent, etc., etc. I haven't done anything except scribble. I haven't had an interesting life at all. I mean, it's interested me, but it couldn't possibly interest the readers.
It's too much.
It couldn't interest the readers.
Couldn't interrupt. I totally disagree. But anyway, it will happen one day.
No, it won't.
Willy-nilly.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, can I ask one more question? Which is, I once reviewed one of your novels, which I'm happy to say I gave it a good review.
Oh, good.
Are you, will you go back? Do you have more fiction lurking?
That's a question I ask myself from time to time. It's not that long ago since I published a novel, but I don't know the answer to your question.
Right.
And also, I don't think there's such a huge divide between the art of fiction and the art of writing biographies, as some people do.
So eagerly awaited.
Oh, well, it's very kind of you. Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
I've got
And
One more question, then I think we need to.
It's a very silly one, probably, because I haven't got.
Extremely unlikely to be silly coming from Anne, of course.
Well, I haven't got the whole way through your book yet.
No.
But I just wondered why were you sacked from the Spectator? I mean, I can't imagine
well,
why they'd do it.
I'm sorry to bore you, but it is too boring to say, but I altered somebody's copy in a way which actually made them appear to be insulting Clive James. And it was...
It must have been a temptation.
It was a temptation, yes. But in spite of the fact we have the greatest biographer of Oscar Wilde in the room, Oscar Wilde was wrong to say one should always yield to temptation. It was a mistake, because I'd still be happily there, grey-bearded, at the Spectator, boring and all stiff.
You couldn't possibly bore us stiff. Thank you both, thank you Andrew and Jane for wonderfully amusing and eclectic conversation. And Andrew's book is, there are only a few copies left, so rush to buy your copy if you haven't bought it yet. And I want to thank Mags again. You're so generous.
I'd like to
Just
thank
sit
Mags
here in
too.
this beautiful Many congratulations to Andrew for winning the exceptional competition.
Thank you very much.
Prize.
I have to go into tax expert, or was it? No, it's not. No, but it's going to be money. Oh, very kind. Thank you.
We need to be out at 8.
But don't worry. You are. Thank you so much.